and covered some stuff. I thought you might like to know what we covered on Saturday. Not that it really matters, but in case you're looking for direction in what to study. The best one of those would be the self-study column in your syllabus. But I picked these out of the self-study column, and on Saturday worked exercise 20-2 and exercise 20-6. And I think I might have worked 21-7, I'm not sure. Some students requested that I video. We videoed quite a bit. We have had some technical difficulties. We didn't get it all there. If that interests you, if you want to see Saturday's review, a large portion of it is on the class website if you'd like to experience that. That's up to you. I have new things for us to cover today and invite you to turn with me to questions at the end of chapter 20, page 894. Hope you've got books with you. Hope if you don't, someone near you does. And you all can share quietly with one another. Page 894. Y'all with me or not? 3. What type of industry is likely to use job order cost system? Give some examples. 4. What type of industry is likely to use a process cost system? Give some examples. Well, rather than wait on you to give some examples, what I did was make up some examples. And I'm asking you to give me a big hearty response to these prompts. Choose process or job order, and at the conclusion of doing all 4 of these, we'll see if we can't reach some conclusion about why your answers were the right answers. How would an oil refinery account for theirs? Would they be process or job order? Say something.
Process.
And a residential construction contractor would be?
Job order.
And how about an automobile manufacturer?
Process.
And how about a shipbuilder? I'm hearing a lot of right answers. The theme of the Saturday review was the obvious and the not so obvious. I'm hoping this was obvious. I started both lectures in the job order and process weeks with this very kind of talk. I think it's important that we know the industries for which job order is more appropriate. Who would use process? We've got to have that worked out in our head. Let us not miss obvious questions on the test. Y'all with me here? So give me the definitive answer on how you made those correct answers. Could somebody address the issue? Why did you choose job order? Why did you choose process correctly each time you chose it? May I have a volunteer? Paula?
I chose process for oil refining because the product is the same.
Let us not talk about one, now that we know them all. Did you choose process for automobile manufacturer for the same reason? That's my point. At this point, can't we talk in broad terms and say who would more likely, not by giving examples, but conceptually, who would be a more likely candidate for a process? When does job order work? What characteristics are involved? I need some help and I need it fast. Nathan's your hand up?
Sure.
Go.
Job order is when it's like a custom thing, so each job is going to be a different price.
Good.
And process is more of a homogeneous product, so things aren't going to be changing as much, so you have a more standard.
Job orders to the customer specifications, and the cost can be differentiated, and the cost can be traced to a particular job. But process is a whole bunch of stuff that's just alike and difficult or impossible to account for individually, Nathan says. Are y'all with Nathan and me?
Yes.
I think that's how you decided that. I just needed us to formalize it. Now, you may want to put a bookmark in your book where you are at this minute, because we're going to flip over to chapter 21 to make a point. Turn to page 939, and we're coming right back here in a moment or two. 939. Question 1 says, identify which costing system, job order, or process the following companies would primarily use. And you can read those companies out of your book or off the screen. Let's do it the same way we did this last one. How about you responding to me? Big Heart. Quaker Oats would more likely be Ford Motor Company. Well, we answered that question previously. How about FedEx, Kinko's Print Shop? And Warner Brothers? Did you apply the same criteria that Nathan and I talked about? Individual jobs that we can trace costs to, unique and different. Or big groups of mass-produced quantities, difficult to distinguish, impossible to distinguish one from another. I hope that you see that this appeared in chapters 20 and 21. That's the point I'm making. These 3 chapters have a lot in common, and this is one of those things. Turn with me to question 6 back in chapter 20, page 894. We're back in chapter 20 again, and looking at question 6, which says, there are 3 inventory control accounts in a job order system. Identify the control accounts and their subsidiary ledgers. I need a volunteer who will name one of the 3 inventory accounts. If you want to name all 3, that'd be fine with me. Just get me rolling. Name me one of the inventory accounts. Here we go.
Raw materials.
Raw materials is the correct answer.
Work in process.
Work in process is the correct answer. And? Woohoo! Nobody wants to raise their hand, but everybody wants to do it. Thank you very much for that overwhelming response. Finished goods. Raw materials, work in process, and finished goods are names of the general ledger accounts in which we record summary information. The best parallel I could draw right this minute would be they're like accounts receivable. In first semester, we used the expression control account with accounts receivable, meaning we had a subsidiary ledger that had detailed information in it. We also had a subsidiary ledger for accounts payable. Same time. We also had, but didn't make as big a deal out of, but we probably should have, a merchandise inventory subsidiary ledger for a perpetual inventory system. In the computer, what those barcodes and those bleeps at the cash register are allowing us to do is keep a database of inventory, have a subsidiary ledger for inventory. And this semester, didn't make as big a deal out of it as we probably should have, but common stock would be a control account. And the stockholders' ledger would be the subsidiary ledger in which we would keep up with the names and addresses and how many shares of stock owners own. It's not an unfamiliar concept. In this chapter, these chapters, raw materials, work in process, finished goods, and a perpetual inventory system have a materials ledger, a cost ledger, and a finished goods ledger that provide the details and support the summary information that you have in the control account. Now, those of you that were here on Saturday saw us do exercise 20-2. And I talked about the cost ledger and the fact that we were distinguishing between the jobs and we had job cost sheets. That's what each individual piece of paper in the cost ledger is called. That's really where most of the activity takes place, is in manufacturing. These are job cost sheets. I hope you're with me. How about following up on this. When I got 3 volunteers to give me 3 good answers for naming those accounts, they said raw materials, work in process, finished goods. I would like to pose the question of you. In what order should these accounts be listed on the balance sheet? I hope you're thinking. I hope you're thinking of a word that you might have learned back in chapter 1, the first time you were asked to prepare a balance sheet. Could you tell me a conceptual answer to this before we entertain the literal answer? How do we record assets on the balance sheet? Tucker's your hand up.
By how fast it can be transferred to cash?
I can name that tune in one note.
Liquidity?
It's called liquidity. We are asked to list assets on the balance sheet in the order of liquidity, in how fast they turn to cash. So with that principle in mind, can you answer this question? I've got raw materials, work in process, finished goods in chronological order. How about balance sheet order? Change your hand up.
Sure.
Talk to me.
Finished goods, work in process, raw materials.
Because
Finished goods are ready to be sold, can be sold immediately.
exactly the way I wanted to hear it, Shane. Thank you. They're ready to be sold. And raw materials
Are not ready to be
are going to take the longest to get ready. We've done the least to them. Did y'all hear Shane's answer? And do you agree? We would list them on the balance sheet in their order of liquidity. Finished goods are ready to sell. Work in process is going to take a while. Raw materials is going to take even longer than that. If you've got a question about this, I'd try to answer it. Anybody, somebody? Good. I want to talk to you for a second or two about raising your awareness level for something that might not be obvious if you didn't talk about it. Now, once you have this idea in mind, I think I can raise your awareness level, and you're going to go back and look through some things, and it's going to that were there all the time, and it's going to be obvious to you. But I just need to call it to your attention. Look with me at question 9, which says, Tony is confused about the source documents used in assigning materials and labor costs. Identify the documents and give the entry for each document. I plan to do exactly that in a minute or two. And I want to call your attention to this list, which we came up with on Saturday, and I thought of again today, and I might have left some off, but some of the source documents that we might use lately are on that list. Now, this happened in the transition that we made first semester from service industries to merchandising concerns. We were concerned about purchase requisitions and purchase orders and invoices and so forth. And we're still concerned about them as a manufacturing firm, providing evidence. Sure, some of this is electronic now, but we still have something that's a reasonable thing going on because we still need this support and evidence in the accounting system. Receiving reports, a materials requisition, time cards, time tickets, or the predetermined manufacturing overhead rate. So let's talk about flow of cost through the accounts and what it would take to accomplish that, how we might accomplish it, and what source documents we might use. Now, I did this by hand at 8:50 this morning and decided I'd do it this way right this minute to see if I could do it a little neater. I want to dictate some journal entries for you. Ultimately, I'd like to describe how costs flow through the accounts. 3 Mondays in a row that we were together, we talked about it. And we need to make journal entries that would parallel that. It's in all 3 chapters, only slightly differently. But what we're adding here that might not have been so obvious is what source document would give us the authority to do that. May I have a volunteer who would make an entry for me, purchased materials on account? I bet lots of people in this room could do that. I just need one. Please, Brandy.
Debit raw materials, credit accounts payable.
Debit raw materials and credit accounts payable for some amount that we paid. This is how we acquire goods. Somebody else owns them. We want to have it in our manufacturing plant. I need to know which of these would be the best answer for the support for that entry. Brandy, the answer I'm looking for is on this list. You would make that entry based on some document named
Either purchase requisition or invoice.
You're going to color in both answers on the answer sheet?
No, I've eliminated.
Don't ever color in two answers on the answer sheet, class. You automatically miss it. It's not purchase requisition. That one is just an internal thing that's going on.
Okay.
But the accumulation of all this information comes down to invoices being one of the really good choices here. My question of all of you is, who prepares the invoice, the buyer or the seller? Say something.
Seller.
The seller does. And receiving reports aren't mentioned in our book, I don't think. Couldn't find it. But receiving reports are something that might happen on our dock, on our receiving area. So our employees might be instructed to prepare a receiving report, which would have the greater authority, what the seller said or what our own employees say. I think receiving report's the better answer to this question, but I'm going to say the book's answer, invoice, but I really like receiving report better than that. If we have a system that has a receiving report, we should do it that way. Okay, here's another entry. How about direct and indirect materials requisition to the factory? Anybody willing to say a generic entry that we could accomplish this? Paula, talk to me.
Debit work in process and credit raw materials.
Is correct. It says direct and indirect materials requisitioned. That was supposed to say requisitioned to the factory. Is your entry enough, Paula? Help me out, somebody. Who sees what Paula doesn't?
Materials overhead, we need a debit.
We also need to debit manufacturing overhead. So let's distinguish between these two debits then. This credit to raw materials is for the total. All the goods are leaving the materials storeroom. Some are going directly into work in process. This was the invoice. This is going to be the source document we're going to name in a minute. What's the distinction between these two debits? Anybody want to address these?
Work in process is direct materials.
This would be direct materials.
Manufacturing overhead is indirect materials.
This would be indirect materials. All the materials left the materials storeroom. Those that went directly into the product are direct materials. Those that go to manufacturing overhead help in all the capacities in the plant. What source document is providing us this information? I need one volunteer hand up to pick me something off that list that would be the source document that would describe that. Paula
Purchase requisition.
is incorrect. We're past that point. That helped us up to the invoice/receiving report stage. That's probably stapled to the back of that as additional evidence. I need a new volunteer hand up quickly.
Materials requisition.
The materials requisition, now that we're in the plant, is not only good for this credit, but it's good for this debit as well. The materials storeroom supervisor is reluctant to give up their materials without proper authorization. You know, we sling the word bureaucracy around rather easily, but yes, they can get out of control, but just having a plan and having some evidence and having support for what you're doing, having some rules and policies and following them, turns out to be a bureaucracy in some cases. I'm so tempted to go off on a little tangent right this minute, but I'd rather stick to this. The materials requisition allows the materials storeroom supervisor to let go of goods. And it places the responsibility on the production foreman in the factory. That guy in the factory now is responsible for those goods, accountable for those goods. The same form that allowed him to let go puts him responsible for those goods. It is a materials requisition. How about factory labor cost incurred? Fastest volunteer in the room? Sir.
Debit factory labor and credit wages payable.
Debit factory labor and credit wages payable, and I just had a thought right this minute that the next exercise I was going to work this morning when time ran out addressed this issue. I may just address it right now. Class, when you go to work for an employer and work at the job, is the salary or wage you earn the only cost your employer incurs? Some of you are saying no. None of you said yes. Some of you didn't say anything, and I don't want to quibble over that. It seems the prevailing answer to my question is no. I'll say it one more time, hoping that you can buy into this. When your employer hires you and pays you a wage, is that the only cost your employer incurs for having you as an employee? Yes or no?
No.
There are other costs associated with your employment. We call them payroll taxes, some of which are levied on the employer. So let's say employer, payroll taxes paid. Y'all going to be able to make heads or tails out of your notes when you get them?
Yes.
So I have this amount that employees have earned. I have this amount that I'm paying in additional taxes on their behalf. And it is this sum that needs to be debited to factory labor. Did anybody follow that?
Yes.
You did something like that in your homework. I don't know that we ever worked an exercise in my classes to address that issue. I thought we should today. Do you have a question about what just happened? Sir?
What did ER stand for?
Employer.
Oh, okay.
Employer, meaning the last two letters of that. Usually we use the first letter to abbreviate them, don't we? But I wanted to differentiate between employee payroll taxes and employer payroll taxes. Thank you for asking. So, I've got factory labor costs that I've incurred. I need to know how to record that. That would be based on which of these source documents. Somebody want to take a shot at this one, please?
Time cards?
Time cards and time tickets would be the two good choices. In my opinion, time cards are at the factory door. You've seen it on TV. You've seen them at the movies, maybe. You step in the back, in the employee entrance at the factory, and there's a big rack of individual cards. One's got your name on it. And you choose the one with your name on it and take a step forward, and there's a clock designed just for this purpose, and a little trench, a little slot on it. You stick your card down in that slot until the clock bites you. Not literally, but it sounds like it. It snaps, and you pull it out, and you step over to this rack, and you put your card there. You go on into the factory, you work all day long, and you reverse the process on the way out. You find your card, you punch out, and you go put it in this rack, and you go home and enjoy the evening. Y'all with me or not?
Yes.
Which did I just describe? Time cards or time tickets? Those are time cards, the basis for payroll. Your check will be the amount of hours that you spend in the factory times your rate. Agreed? Time tickets serve what purpose?
The actual amount worked.
How did you spend your time during the day? If you worked on job 40 the entire 8 hours you were there, that's not a problem. We can allocate all your costs to job 430. But the idea is that these different jobs on which we work have costs that we can trace to those specific jobs. We might work 2 hours on one job and 3 hours on another job and an hour on a third. Well, some way, somehow we need to keep up with that. So we keep up with our time during the day. Lawyers do this, and they bill customers appropriately. Accountants do this. I did this when I was Filing tax returns for a client. I'd go get a new batch of material out of the drawer, I'd open it up, and the manager had stuck a note in there and said what the budget would be. Maybe it was to take me 14 hours to do this tax return. Maybe it was to take me 4 hours. Try to do it within the allotted time. But then we have an idea of how much to bill the client. This is not manufacturing, but the principle we learn here, we can apply someplace else if we understand what's going on. So, which is the basis for this entry? What's this answer? This is time cards. This is time cards. It's time cards that allows us to accumulate the information in factory labor. Then direct and indirect labor costs are allocated to production based on time tickets. Would somebody make me this entry, please?
Work in process debit.
Debit work in process. Did you make me this last entry?
Yes, I did.
Then get off the hook.
Okay.
Don't be greedy. Thank you for being willing.
Thank you.
Tucker
Credit factory labor
is correct.
and debit manufacturing overhead.
Thank you. Debit manufacturing overhead, how much, Tucker?
For indirect labor.
Debit manufacturing overhead, how much, Tucker?
Indirect labor.
I did that one wrong. Did you say direct first time?
But you said manufacturing overhead the first time.
Did I?
Yeah.
Don't ask me about it. And this would be the total.
The total.
In fact, to use the same symbol I used earlier, that might be a smart way to say that. Y'all with me here? So we debited work in process for materials. Then based on the time tickets, we've gotten some labor cost in work in process. Miscellaneous manufacturing costs paid. Is that a question hand or an answer hand?
Question.
Oh, rats. What? What?
When you're using the vocabulary applied and actual, can we inject that into the one you just did before?
This one right here?
Uh-huh. So with the
No.
No. Okay.
We might have to sometime, but I'd rather not. I almost worded it that way, Brandy,
Okay.
but I chose not to because I don't want us to confuse it someplace else.
Okay.
May I have some help on this one, please, quickly? This is miscellaneous manufacturing costs paid. Help?
Manufacturing.
Oh, I need a hand up so I'll know who I'm listening to. Did I hear an answer up here on the front row?
I just said credit cash.
Credit cash, thank you. Somebody had to say it. For the amount paid. Debit, please. This is a debit to manufacturing overhead. Instead of saying paid, I wish I had said, is this actual or applied? You all need to decide. Is this actual or applied?
Actual.
This is actual. Actual and actual. Based on, I don't know, pick something over there. Invoice maybe? I didn't plan that part very well. We got to have some documentation for that. Or, let's say check. We wrote a check for that. Yes, this credit to cash. Applied overhead costs to production. Well, I've got materials cost, I've got labor cost, I need some overhead to go with that so that I can produce a product. Here it comes. A theme throughout all 3 chapters. Debit. Oh yeah. You did the last one. New volunteer. Tucker.
Debit work in process. Credit manufacturing overhead.
How much, Tucker?
For applied.
This is the applied amount. This is the estimate. This is the, if you based it on machine hours, you've got to go find machine hours and multiply it by the rate. If you based it on direct labor, then you're going to have to go someplace else and find out how much was direct labor and multiply it by some rate that you've determined. This is debit work in process, credit manufacturing overhead, based on that list over there, the predetermined manufacturing overhead rate. Yes or no?
Yes.
Go with me or not? you need to know a lot about manufacturing overhead. And at the risk of running out of time, I probably should say it right this minute. But there's one of those videos online where I covered it on Saturday. You could go find it out there too. I'm going to say it faster than you can write it down, but I'm going to say it. What do you need to know about manufacturing overhead? What's the whole picture? Well, first of all, you ought to have some reason for why we're doing it this way at all. Why not just do it like materials and labor? There's a good explanation for that. Then, how do you do it? The formula is estimated overhead for the whole year divided by an estimate of your activity base for the whole year, which we've boiled down to say overhead divided by an activity. Then, how do you do it? Part 2 is this entry right here. You debit work in process and credit manufacturing overhead for this. Go someplace else, find this month's information, multiply it by the rate, and make the entry for that much. Now, what outcome do we come up with? What problems does it create? Income summary zeroes out. Factory labor zeroes out. Other accounts like that zero out. But when we debit manufacturing overhead with actual and credit it with applied, there's a highly likely chance that it's not going to zero out. We need to know what to do with that monthly. We need to know what to do with that annually. I covered it in my classes in exercise 20-5. There's a video of that on the website if you want to see it. I've talked about it in the review on Saturday. I gave you a half-sheet handout describing that. You need to know what to do with manufacturing overhead monthly and what to do with it annually. That's all I'm going to say about it now. It may come up again in a few minutes. When I've got 3 debits to work in process, one for materials, one for labor, one for overhead, then I should be able to produce a product. And sure enough, the exercise says we finished some goods. Who's willing to make me this entry? Paula?
Debit finished goods, credit work in process.
Debit finished goods, credit work in process allows us to draw this arrow to finished goods. And I'm going to say this amount is the distinguishing feature between these 3 chapters. Chapter 20, job order, Chapter 21, process, and Chapter 25 have a lot in common. There are at least 2 things that differentiate. The major one is, how do you find the cost of finished goods? In Chapter 21, you sum the cost on the job cost sheets. I did exercise 20-2 at the review and an exercise like that in class where we posted the job cost sheets and saw that happen. In Chapter 21, it's process costing. There are some steps that we go through. The steps are physical units, equivalent units, unit cost for materials and conversion cost. Find the cost of goods you finished based on those. Find the cost of goods you haven't finished based on those. We did it that week over and over and over again, and all the other things in that chapter seem to be similar to the previous chapter. This is pretty straightforward and obvious that these are the things you need to know from that chapter. In Chapter 25, it's based on the standard cost of 1 unit. We should be able to develop and determine the standard cost for 1 unit. You were asked in your homework to make an entry similar to this one, where you multiplied the standard cost of 1 unit times the units you completed. It is the way we get the amount of that entry that seems to differentiate these 3 chapters. Did I waste your time just now?
No.
I hope not. You need to know these obvious things and some things that weren't so obvious, the source document discussion of this raised your awareness level, I believe, I hope, so that if I took you on a little quick trip right this minute, if I had unlimited time, I would do this a little more deliberately. But I don't have unlimited time. If you want to write this down or just experience or take my word for it or go find it on the website, the slide's there someplace. If we turned in the book and just read a little bit of self-study question 4, I think that might be the one we did, I'm not sure. It was about source documents. 20-2, I did it to review on Saturday. This is about the third or fourth time I've mentioned it. If you look at that now, it talks about materials requisitions and time tickets. 20-6, we worked in the review on Saturday, and the question was, I'm not asking you to work the whole exercise or watch the video. I'm asking you to turn to that exercise and read the first question. What source documents would be involved in that? The book brought it up. I didn't. 20-7 mentions source documents. You were assigned 20-3A, and it mentions the source documents and provides a distinction between the materials cost and the labor cost that you've incurred. It'll leap off the page at you now that you've had your awareness level raised. In Monday's lecture, we did question 14 and 17 and 18. Did I say in Monday's lecture? Did I just say that?
Mm-hmm.
In Saturday's review, we worked those exercises. I'm going to try to accomplish that with a different exercise right this minute. How about turning with me to brief exercise 20-9. Brief exercise 20-9 is on page 894 and deals with something that I brought up a few minutes ago about the whole story about manufacturing overhead. Why do we do it that way? How do we do it that way? How do we do it that way? That's 2 steps. And steps 4 and 5 are, what do you do with it at the end of the month, and what do you do with it at the end of the year? Brief exercise 20-9 says, at December 31st, balances in manufacturing overhead are L Company debit $1,500, P Company credit $900. How about, let's not even read the rest of that. I don't know why they gave us 2 companies in a brief exercise. We can handle this. It would have been nice to say the first company's name, the month of August, and the month of September. Same company. The first situation said it was a debit balance. Do I remember that correctly? I've walked away from my book. We need adjectives to describe this balance of manufacturing overhead. I'm gesturing as if you are looking at a T account, this being the debit side, this being the credit side. Here's manufacturing overhead, if you want to think of it that way. Manufacturing overhead is debited for what adjective?
Underapplied.
No, you got to my conclusion. I wanted to start at the beginning.
Okay.
Is debited for an adjective. What kinds of costs do we debit to manufacturing overhead? I was thinking actual or applied. Actual or applied? Say something. Actual costs are debited to manufacturing overhead. Yes or no?
Yes.
And therefore we credit manufacturing overhead with applied. Now, they might be exactly the same. Chances are they're not going to be. If this account balance is debit, which was larger, actual or applied?
Actual.
If actual exceeds applied, are we going to call this underapplied or overapplied?
Underapplied.
I think that's logical. I think we could go get a man or a woman out of the hallway and drag them in here and in 2 or 3 minutes ask them to logically approach this. I don't think you have to have a whole lot of accounting training or be in this class a very long time to reach this logical conclusion. A debit balance in that account is underapplied because this number is smaller.
Credit is
The
smaller.
credit is smaller.
than the debit.
The applied amount is smaller. If this balance is credit, it's because the credits exceeded the debits. It's possible. Is that underapplied or overapplied? Say something. And the name of this first company was L? Yes? Their balance was debit. L company had a debit balance which would make it overapplied or underapplied. Say something. Theirs was underapplied. It was a debit balance. So we've got two decisions to make. What do we do with this monthly? The answer is we carry it over. The question might be, on which financial statement does it appear? In order to carry things over, we put them on the balance sheet. If this has a debit balance, it needs to go on the balance sheet where other debits are among the assets. This is a deferral, and so are supplies, and so are prepaid expenses. This unallocated debit should be on the balance sheet 11 months out of the year. We just keep carrying its balance over. At the end of the year, we want to eliminate manufacturing overhead. It should not appear on an annual financial statement. We have two choices. We could either just close the whole thing to cost of goods sold. If it's small and insignificant, if it doesn't really matter, if it's not going to distort the results, we should just move it to cost of goods sold. Read the problem with me. This is brief exercise 20-9. It says L company, skip down to the question. Prepare the adjusting entry for each company at December 31st. Here's the phrase I want you to hear. Assuming the adjustment is made to cost of goods sold. What are they saying there? This is small or large?
Small.
It's small. If it's small, most of the things you produced are moved on to cost of goods sold anyway. Just put it in cost of goods sold. Now, the other company mentioned there has a credit balance, which we've now reviewed, and you know without a shadow of a doubt, we would describe that as underapplied or overapplied, and everybody said? Overapplied. And that credit balance goes on the balance sheet. A debit balance is not a prepaid expense, and this is not unearned revenue. It goes the same place where prepaid expenses go. It goes the same place where unearned revenue goes. These are deferrals. It goes on the balance sheet among the credits. This credit balance goes among the credits. It's a deferral. And if we're going to deal with a small amount, then we wouldn't show it on the annual financial statement. If it's a small amount, we're going to allocate it to cost of goods sold. If it's a large amount, however, we need to go back and restate the accounts that were misstated significantly to their actual amounts. That would be work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. You don't have to worry about the math. You're not going to be asked to accomplish that. You might be asked about the concept. I distributed a half-sheet handout. Every student should have gotten one. It's on the class website. The 7th edition of the book gave more details than the 8th edition. I've quoted the 7th edition of the book on the class website. You might want to read that and reinforce what you heard me say in class originally and today. That would help you understand that better. I've got another hour's worth at least. Why don't y'all just skip your next class and we'll work a little longer. Seriously, I hope that you'll do a good review, that you'll do a great job on the test, and that you'll have a wonderful day today. Help me get the attendance sheets, all of them.